Kit Carson, Part 19.
As soon as the necessary preparations could be made, another campaign was to be made against the enemy. Colonel Cook took command of the troops that had been engaged in the two preceding campaigns and marched to Taos. The men were much worn down by the hardships they had undergone, and the animals were badly used up, and both men and horses required repose. I can say of Colonel Cook that he is as efficient an Indian fighter as I've ever accompanied, that he is brave and gallant, everyone knows. By reason of his persevering pursuit of them, the Indians lost many of their number from hardships and the severe cold, and they would not have been able to elude him if they had not been so fortunate as to have kept the horses they had captured in their fight with Lieutenant Davidson, but would have been caught and chastised so thoroughly that war with that tribe would never have occurred again. Major Brooks now took the field against the Indians, and after following their trail for several days, he arrived in the Utah country. Finding that the country was entirely cut up with trails and that it was impossible to identify the one made by the enemy, he was compelled to give up the pursuit and return to Taos, where he arrived about the 15th of May. He had been in the field some 10 or 15 days and had not encountered a single enemy. Major Carleton of the 1st Dragoons was encamped in Taos, making preparations for a campaign. By the 23rd of May, he was ready to march. I accompanied him as principal guide. We marched north to Fort Massachusetts, where the spies under command of Captain Quinn were turned west to the White Mountains and thence along their base to the Moscow Pass, and through this to the Huerfano, his object being to discover the trail. From the place where Major Brooks gave up the pursuit, it was evident that the Indians were making for the Moscow Pass. The command marched through the Sangre de Cristo Pass, Major Carleton having agreed to join Captain Quinn on the Huerfano in 3 days. I discovered the trail of 3 Indians in the pass and followed it till I came to the main trail near the Huerfano. At the entrance of the Moscow Pass, Captain Quinn discovered an old encampment of the Indians. As we had anticipated, they had gone through the pass. We now followed the main trail for 6 days through very rugged country. Mountains, canyons, and ravines had to be passed, but at last we overtook the Indians and camped in the Raton Mountains on the east side of Fisher's Peak. The troops charged their village, and the Indians fled. Some of them were killed, and about 40 of their horses were captured. The soldiers followed them until it became dark. A party of men under command of Lieutenant R. Johnston of the 1st Dragoons and Captain Quinn and 3 of his spies were left behind at the village. They concealed themselves in the brush, and one of the spies who knew the rallying call made by these Indians when they were scattered sounded it. 2 warriors and 2 squaws made their appearance. The spies fired on them and killed one of the warriors. The noise of the firing and the yells of those who escaped warned the Indians of the proximity of the soldiers, and nothing more was accomplished. The brush was thick in the vicinity of the village and afforded many hiding places in which the Indians took refuge. It was entirely owing to the good management of Major Carleton that the Indians were discovered. He directed the spies to keep the trail and the troops following them, keeping concealed as much as possible by marching through the brush and timber. In the morning of the day we overtook the Indians, I saw a trail that was fresh and told the major that if we met with no accident, we would find them by 2 o'clock. He replied that if this proved to be the case, he would give me one of the finest hats that could be procured in New York. The Indians were found at the very hour I had predicted, and the major fulfilled his promise, presenting me a hat which he had made in New York, and a fine one it was. The command now marched back for a few miles and encamped for the night. The next day we began the return to Taos, traveling to the headwaters of the Canadian and its tributaries. We passed through a beautiful mountain country and arrived at Taos in June. I did not engage in any other campaign for the remainder of the year. In July, Major Blake of the 1st Dragoons made another campaign. He was absent some time, but did not find any Indians. In August, I left the agency to visit the Utahs for the purpose of collecting them to meet the superintendent at Abiqui in October. To accomplish this, I had to travel about 200 miles and pass close to a village of Apaches. I got by without being discovered by them and arrived at the Utah village. I told the natives that the superintendent wished to see them in October, and they agreed to pay him a visit. I then set out for the agency, arriving home a few days later. In October, I proceeded to the council. The Indians attended as they had promised to do. Presents were given to them, and they appeared friendly. Shortly previous to the council, however, some Mexicans had killed a Utah for the purpose of stealing his coat. The Indians were very much dissatisfied, requesting payment in horses for the death of the Indian. This was refused them, but they were promised that the murderers would be arrested and punished according to the law. One of the murderers was apprehended eventually, but he made his escape soon after, and no further efforts were made to render justice to the Indians. Smallpox broke out among the Indians while they were on their way to their hunting ground, and the leading men of the band of Mosh Utahs died. Now they came to the conclusion that the superintendent was the cause of this affliction and that he'd collected them for the purpose of injuring them. He'd given a blanket coat to each of the headmen, and since everyone who received a coat had died, the Indians firmly believed that the coats were the cause of the deaths. Aside from this, the murder of the Indians had been allowed to go unpunished, and the Indians had but little faith in anything the superintendent promised them. So they prepared for war, and joining the Apaches, they commenced their depredations. They attacked the settlement of Costilla, drove off nearly all the stock, and stole and murdered all the citizens they could find. The regular troops in the country were not strong enough to take the field against the Utahs and the Apaches combined, and the governor issued a proclamation calling for 6 companies of volunteers. The response was immediate, and the companies were organized. Several more companies than were needed offered their services, showing the willingness of the people to perform military service when called upon to punish their enemies. If the chastisement of the Indians of this country were left to the citizens, I don't doubt that in a short period they would be subdued. As matters stand at present, the Indians are the masters of the country and commit depredations where, when, and where they please. Perhaps a command of troops is sent after them. They're overtaken, and some of the property they stole is recovered, while they make their escape unpunished. The superintendent then calls them in to have a grand talk. Presents are given and promises are made, but only to be broken when it becomes convenient to break them. As long as these mountain Indians are permitted to run at large in the country, the country is going to always remain in its impoverished state, and the only remedy is to compel them to live in settlements, cultivate the soil, and learn to gain their maintenance independently of the general government. End of part 19.